Today we're going to start, we're going to do lesson 4 and lesson 5. So this is the lesson about the U.S. joining. So as you know from last time, the U.S. decided to join the war in 1917. Okay, so, right, it started in 1914. So 3 years in, we decided to finally get involved. Now, it takes a lot to mobilize. Mobilize means to, get everything ready, troops and all the supplies, okay? So there's things that a government can do during wartime to make things go better. And in fact, we're seeing some of that right now with the coronavirus, that the president is, do you remember that the president had some companies change over, like instead of making cars, they're going to change over and make ventilators, right, during this coronavirus pandemic? Well, the same kind of thing happens during wartime, okay? So the National War Labor Board is one of the things that they make, and their job is to try to make sure that all the factories are working all the time really quickly to get the war materials made. And one of the issues they've been having for a long time, right, is workers going on strike because of the bad conditions. We've talked about that before. So this board put a lot of pressure on the businesses to make sure that the workers are not going to be unhappy enough that they'll refuse to work. So that really helped finally for workers to get fair things like an 8-hour workday, overtime pay, equal pay for women, and the right that it's okay to have a union, okay, to fight for their rights. And in return for all those things, they won't strike, right? So that was good. The other thing is, it takes a lot of money, of course, for the government to run a war. So the two main ways they're going to get money for the war is, of course, raising taxes is one way. And the other way is to get money for the war by selling war bonds. We've talked about that before, right? That voluntarily people will buy the bonds, and the idea is that basically it's like a loan, right? The government has your money to use and spend right now, and then over time they'll pay you back and with a little bit of interest. That's why you're willing to do it. Okay, so the only problem with all this is that a lot of the men, like millions of them, right, are away fighting in the military. And so who's going to do all these jobs that are typically men? Well, of course, women step up and for the first time are doing men's kind of factory jobs. And so that is like a new thing for women, and they prove that they can do it and things like that. And then African Americans too. We've talked about that, how that so many of them came to the North looking for these jobs from the South, and that was called the Great Migration, when so many people move in one big group. So a very large percentage of African Americans see an opportunity and go to the North to try to get work there. We also see some Mexicans migrating to the United States at this time too. Okay, so what else are they going to do to make sure that the mobilization goes well? Well, they make another agency called the Food Administration, and Herbert Hoover was in charge of that, and we will talk about him later in history as a president. His job was to make sure that there's enough food for the soldiers. And so there's going to be encouraging farmers to make more, but also we need the public to eat less. Okay, and they would do that voluntarily, a lot of public propaganda and public pressure, asking people to ration or, not use as much of certain things so that the soldiers can have it. And between those two things, they are successful in getting more for the soldiers. The War Industries Board is helping the factories shift, right? Like I said before, if you were an automobile company and then now you're making more materials, right? So helping them shift and also keeping track of prices so that the consumer, the prices don't get out of control during this wartime. Another thing they had is they needed more fuel. Coal and oil were the two major fuel sources at that time. And so they had the Fuel Administration, whose job was to try to save the fuel, encourage people to use less. They came up with creative things like heatless Mondays. They also introduced daylight savings time, right? We've talked about daylight savings time before, that we do that so that you don't need, right, to burn an oil lamp because you're using more of the daylight, right? So that's why we change our times. And then another thing that they needed to do is really to increase the public's support of the war. A lot of people weren't so happy about us going to war, right? People are worried about it, and your family members are going to die in the war, and it seems so far away. So they hired a famous journalist at the time, George Creel, to start a committee called the Committee on Public Information. And it was basically a huge propaganda machine, lots of pamphlets and articles and newspapers and posters and trying to get out like the feeling of democracy and that the war was like a moral reason to go fight. We're fighting for freedom, right? And they made it like kind of cool to be part of the war effort, and famous artists and actors and people that would make people want to do it, right, got involved in this effort. So you see a lot of the propaganda posters trying to make it like very patriotic, okay? And basically it came to be that people would, if you were against the war, then they took your patriotism into question, right? And so it became like un-American to criticize the government or the war effort. That was unfortunate, right? Because there are a lot of people, like we talked about in the beginning when we were first talking about the war, that, if you are an immigrant and you have family members over in, let's say, Germany, that's going to be an issue, right? It's going to be hard to be happy that we're going to war against your family members. There's also certain people who are against how the whole war was going anyway, like socialists. One of the big problems socialists had was that they did not like that certain business people were making a lot of money off of the war effort, right? Because they could make more materials and the government buys it from them and they get rich. And they don't like that. They thought industries that are doing these things should be owned by the government or by the public, really. Therefore, it's not, everyone's treated more equally. It's not some people getting ahead, okay? Pacifists, of course, are also people who are against war in general, so they're not going to be in favor of the war. And it really got bad where you could be in danger if you spoke out against the war effort. If you were supposedly seen as doing any of these things, you could get in big trouble. Congress passed a law, the Espionage Act, which said if you're caught spying, that's what espionage is, right? Or even supposedly aiding the enemy or interfering with army recruiting, then you could get in trouble. And the reason for that is, right, if you're going to do like a protest and you're going to say that the war is terrible or whatever, one of the ways that they would do that is to do it in front of like a recruiting office to discourage young people from volunteering, right? So of course, the government saw that as hurting their war effort. So they said that was part of the law, that's against, the war effort, that's considered like working then for the enemy, right? So they also made the Sabotage Act. if you did anything that would hurt the war effort, like destroy war supplies or any kind of property or transport, meaning like planes or anything kind of transportation, then you could get in big trouble. Okay, so again, like if you were going to protest, that might be something that you did, is interrupt that supply line or destroy, supplies. The Sedition Act makes it a crime to print, write, or say anything that's critical of the government. And we've talked about the Sedition Act previously, right? And so it's, again, that they make that true, again, that you can be convicted, and that did happen if you were, especially, writing things in the newspaper or whatever. And you would think, as we've talked about before, that the Sedition Act especially would be against your rights of freedom of speech. And it was actually even brought to court, saying that that's going against the Constitution. And surprisingly, the Supreme Court actually said, no, the law is fine. Basically in wartime, you got to do what you got to do. And it's not against your rights if you're working against the government, right? And against the war effort. And so they said it was fine. Interesting. Remember, too, the Supreme Court, it depends on who is on the bench. That is why right now there is a very big push. The Senate went back today to work because they want to push in a lot of federal judges. The Republicans do, while they still have the power. Before the elections happen, and we'll see what happens. I think some of these issues might come up again, but right now it's a conservative court, so the same thing could happen again. All right, on to the next one. So to make a long story short, we know that eventually, we already talked about this, right? That the war is going to end, that it's going to fall apart, right? And in 1919, the 27 nations gathered for a peace conference in Paris, France, and they want to try to make sure that nothing like this happens again, okay? Remember, think of the time. It's kind of interesting right now in today's pandemic world. So it was kind of similar in 1919, right? I'm sure you've heard about the Spanish flu, that, millions of people were dying of influenza epidemic back then at the same time too. So imagine, right, they've just had war. Europe is a mess from all the fighting. All the farms are ruined and towns are blown up and things. And then we've been having like civil wars and all these places, right, trying to get independence. And it's basically a mess in Europe. And then, of course, all the people dying or really injured from the war. And then now there's this influenza outbreak too. So they meet, and Woodrow Wilson, our president at the time, really has this big plan he's trying to make some like lasting peace. It's not just stopping this war, but he wants to make sure this never happens again. So he has 14 different points or ideas that he comes with his peace plan. And I'm not going to make you know it in detail. In high school, you may need to, know each of the 14 points. But basically, it was things about like not having secret treaties anymore and encouraging free trade and all these different ideas that would make like a perfect world and arms limitations and things like that. But his last point and his like baby was this idea of the League of Nations. And he thought that if all the countries agreed to be in this group together and basically, they are going to work out their problems and prevent wars from happening like this in the future. That's his goal. Okay. So he has all these lofty ideas to go and tell everyone. And at first it seemed okay, but then when it basically comes down to it, is everyone else had been in the war much longer than us and lost a lot more and spent a lot more money and a lot more of their farmland and things are ruined, right? So everyone else really wants revenge, and Wilson's all talking about all these like lofty ideas that are hard to actually do in reality. The four people, by the way, Germany and Russia were not involved, right? We're not invited to this because they're like the enemy, right? So the four people, the main four people, are called the Big Four, was the U.S. with President Wilson. Great Britain was there, hit the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. France had their premier, their leader, George Clemenceau. And the Italians had their prime minister, Vittorio Orlando. Okay. And so those four are talking it out. And, as it goes on, it turns out that especially Britain and France, who did a lot of the loss of life and money and land, want revenge. They want payment for all their suffering, okay? And so Wilson had a really hard time trying to get them to agree to any of his 14 points. In fact, in the end, he only really got his one. He gave up a lot of what he wanted to get his 1 point. We'll talk about that in a second. So they come up with the Treaty of Versailles, and the Treaty of Versailles was pretty tough on Germany. It said Germany has to accept all responsibility for the war, which, if you think about it from the beginning, right, it wasn't even the Germans at the very beginning, but they did encourage everything. They have to pay the Allies billions of dollars in reparations payments. They have to disarm completely and give up a bunch of their colonies and territory in Europe. So they're giving up a lot, okay? Of course, they also don't just deal with the Germans, the Austrian-Hungaries, and the Russians. They also are going to be broken apart. And that's a lot of where some of the conflicts are with this, right? People didn't agree on, who should be independent and what should happen to all those places that were in those empires before. But Wilson does get his League of Nations, and he figured it was worth all the compromises because then at least, right, if they join the League, then they can work out all these things later once they're committed to, working things out and not getting in wars again. Okay. So he has his grand plan. He comes home, and of course, all treaties have to be approved by the Senate. That's always true. And so he brings it to the Senate. And, not a lot of Americans thought it was a great idea. Some thought it was pretty harsh on Germany, which it was. A lot of people were worried about his League of Nations idea, right? Remember that America was a pretty isolationist before, and being like committing to this group seemed like, well, we're going to be drawn into other problems in the future, right? That doesn't seem like a good idea. We should just worry about ourselves. So he was trying to, explain why it was a good idea. Unfortunately, it got very political, okay? And he's a Democrat, and the Republicans control the Senate, and they see this as an opportunity to make him look bad and to make the Democrats look bad and go into the election in 1920 coming up looking weaker, right? So the biggest person who worked actively against him was Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a Senate Foreign Relations Committee head. And he delays the vote on purpose, and he tries to line up people to talk against it. He makes sure things get added to the treaty proposal, saying we should limit how much the U.S. is obligated to in this treaty. Wilson really wants this to pass, so he starts touring around the country, trying to give speeches and get people to agree that this is a good idea for the treaty, and especially his, beloved League of Nations. And unfortunately for him, he exhausts himself and his health gets really bad, and he actually suffers a stroke. And so, of course, he's now not doing well. He did not die, but his health isn't good. And of course, without him fighting for it, the Senate keeps on their track and opposition grows. And what they vote to do actually is to say, no, we're not going to sign this Treaty of Versailles, even though he had worked so hard, Wilson, to go and make all these, compromises. And so he does not end up running for the next election. And what ends up happening afterwards is the U.S. decides, since we're not going to sign the Treaty of Versailles, we'll make some special, separate peace treaties with each of the Central Powers, and we'll make our own peace with them. And the rest of the countries went ahead with their Treaty of Versailles. And and the League of Nations did happen, but U.S. didn't join, which is really, really sad, right? With Wilson, right? That was the thing he wanted more than anything.